Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar that is co-hosted by the British Association for Local History and the Historic Towns Trust in the second of our series this evening. So welcome. And as some of you have already found, if you do want to ask a question to our speaker this evening, please use the Q&A function at either the bottom or the top of your screen. For those of you who are wondering, as it's a webinar, your audio settings will be muted, so please use this function to communicate with our speaker. I'm now going to hand over to our president of the BALH, who is also a trustee of the Historic Towns Trust, Professor Emerita Caroline Barron, who will introduce our speaker this evening. So over to you, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Megan, and good evening and welcome to everybody who's come to this webinar to hear Matthew Davies talk about the Layers of London project. As Megan said, I wear two hats. I'm the president of the British Association of Local History, and I am a trustee of the Historic Towns Trust. So it's particularly pleasing that these two associations have come together in these series of webinars. Now, Matthew is currently Executive Dean at Birkbeck College, University of London, but in his spare time, he's a historian of medieval London, and he's also, of course, a professor of urban history. And in this series, the Historic Towns Trust have joined with the British Association of Local History, and 4 particular towns are being focused on. We heard about the last webinar, we heard about Swansea. Tonight, we're going to hear about London. Next, in a couple of weeks, we'll hear about Perth. And then after that, we're going to hear about Beverley. So you can see we cover the whole of, well, I was going to say, England, Wales, and Scotland. And of course, there's some debate as to whether London is really local history. Well, of course, it is local history. It's just local history writ large. And Matthew is, as I said, a historian of medieval London. He's particularly worked on the histories of the city livery companies and the way in which they were organized, the way they grew in the late 14th, 15th centuries, the way they changed in the 16th century. His particular focus has been on the merchant tailors, but he looks at other city companies as well. And he looks also, I think, at the location of crafts in London. That is, where did people of the same craft get together to practice their craft or trade? And that brings us on to maps, because obviously this is one of the things that you can map, is where people lived and where they practiced their craft or trade. So Matthew is the director of the project called the Layers of London, which he's obviously going to tell you about, so I'm not going to tell you. He's been doing that since 2016, and I'm sorry, he directs this through the Institute of Historical Research. So it's really great that he's going to tell us about the Layers of London and what it has done and what he hopes it will do. So over to you, Matthew, and thank you for talking to us.
Thanks so much, Caroline. I hope my screen's now available to people to see. Good, thank you. Well, thank you, Caroline. Like Caroline, I'm also wearing 2 hats. I'm also a trustee of the Historic Towns Trust. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about the work of the trust as part of this talk. Well, as Caroline says, I'm going to talk about the Layers of London project, and some of you may have already had a chance to look at it already online. And this is just a screenshot of the opening page of the website and the map displaying all the content that we have. And I'm going to talk a bit about maps, quite a lot about maps actually, and then more about the content and how you can contribute to the map. So I think that's one of the key features of our website. It's not just about us providing things for you, it's about you providing things to the website and the wider community as well. So I wanted to start by talking about what the project is, what it's for, and essentially it's about, as Caroline said, local histories of different kinds in London. London has lots of different kinds of places, lots of different kinds of local histories, different kinds of communities. And what we want to do is uncover and share those as widely as possible, freely through our website. And a lot of this is done through crowdsourcing, working with volunteer groups, just opening up the website for people to create collections and records. And I'll say a bit more about how we do that later on. And a really important function of what we do is to try and recover and record and share lost heritage or heritage that's about to disappear, whether it's through development or other kinds of changes in London. London's always changing, and things need to be preserved in at least in digital form if we possibly can do. And thereby we're very conscious of our role in trying to contribute to broader digital heritage and engagement strategies, particularly with the organisations that we work with in government, in heritage more broadly, museums, galleries, libraries, and so on. So how do we do this? Well, it's a combination, as I said, of digital mapping and public engagement, and the two really come together on Layers of London. So far we've digitised more than 300 maps of different kinds, different scales, as well as geolocated data. So it's data sets that you can tie to particular places in London. And many of these have been acquired from partners from museums, galleries, archives, and libraries. But also a key element, as I've said, is this content creation by what we call participatory mapping. Community projects, schools, individuals right across London, the UK, the world, in fact, have contributed. So we have more than 12,000 records in 420 collections, and also 11 walking trails. We've just created a new function recently that allows you to create your own walking trail through London by connecting records together. And as Caroline says, we began in 2016, and we had just over £1 million from the Heritage Lottery Fund, very generously funded us, as well as funding from a number of foundations through the Institute of Historical Research. And then we migrated, after our main funding period ended, we migrated to a platform called HUMAP, which I'll say a bit more about in a moment. But this is really just a set of logos of some of our partners: the City of London, Museum of London Archaeology, the British Library, and of course the Historic Towns Trust, a really key partner for us. And when we started, there were very few precedents for what we wanted to do, trying to combine mapping on the one hand and crowdsourced content on another. So one of the sort of closest matches we found to what we wanted to do was Know Your Place in Bristol, which some of you may have come across already. Again, you can see on the right-hand side where you can click on particular kinds of collections. Know Your Place began partly through Bristol City Council's planning office, so it looks very much like a planning tool in some ways, as you would see on a local authority website. But that means they can be really good at displaying data, organizing map layers, and so on. So we took a lot of inspiration from that website, and we talked to them a great deal before we began our own project. And now, just to mention HUMAP, again, as I said, we migrated to HUMAP. HUMAP were our original technical partners, and we worked together very closely to develop Layers of London in a sort of alpha version, beta version, and so on. And then after our funding ended, we agreed to work with them to develop a platform called HUMAP, which is essentially a larger version of Layers of London. And they now have, I think it's 7 or 8 projects, which are all hosted on this platform. They all use the same sort of framework and technology. We're part of a family of projects, effectively, and you can see some of them here. The Vienna Holocaust Library, Mapping Coventry, Coventry Atlas, again, which also uses a map from the Historic Towns Trust, and Islington's Pride, one of their earlier projects. So if you look at them just now, you can see they sort of share DNA with Layers of London in terms of their appearance and how they structure things. And for us, it's a really important partnership because it helps us with our sustainability strategy, because after 5 years, our funding came to an end, and then we need to look for a way to become sustainable in the long term. So this is a way to become part of a family, to benefit from new projects, which HUMAP works with, and we get some new functionality when that happens. And they've got a big announcement coming up quite soon about a new project that they're about to launch. So that's been a very fruitful partnership, and it's partly thinking about how projects such as ours, which have short-term funding, can try and have a long-term future. So I'm going to start by talking about maps. I like maps, we all like maps. We call them on the website, that we use the term overlay to describe maps and data sets, anything you put on top of a modern map. As I said, we have more than 300 maps and data sets, ranging from very small borough and estate maps right through to huge maps of the whole of the metropolis from different periods. And our data sets include things like geology, archaeology, even we have a data set of trees in London, listed trees, so you can see what trees are where, what types of trees. One's that cause pollen just outside my office in Bloomsbury, for example, and other sort of features of London, sort of landscape, if you like. And I want to go back in time a little bit now, because Layers of London sort of started off in about sort of in inspiration, at least in about 2010, 2011, with two connected projects where we worked on some really important early modern maps of London. The first of which is William Morgan's 1682 map of London, which is commonly thought to be regarded as the earliest properly surveyed map of London. And what we did was to digitize it and georeference it. Now, both of those things are not as straightforward as they might sound, because maps such as this were first of all printed as individual sheets. So a number of sheets made up this map originally, and what we had to do was stitch them together digitally, which was a very sort of finely tuned process, which the Museum of London Archaeology handled for us as part of their contribution to our various projects. So as well as stitching them together, you then have to georeference, which is essentially putting this on top of a modern map, connecting points on the map to points that exist in the present world, or at least on Ordnance Survey maps. And you can see here sort of a graphical representation on the right-hand side of how you do this. You do this through thousands and thousands of control points, linking together the past and the present effectively. So corners of buildings that existed in 1682 and those same exact corners today. And we use thousands and thousands of them because the other point about these maps is that they are very, very big. And to give you an example, or to show you how big they are, I'm going to show you the second map that we use, which is John Roke's map of 1746. Actually, before I come on to that, I'll just talk about a couple of things about Morgan's map, which are interesting, because unusually Morgan has a number of little drawings on the map of buildings in a sort of 3D. But what's interesting in this case is that William Morgan was speculating a bit about what St Paul's would look like, because it wasn't finished when he drew the map. So the nearest he could get was to use the current design, about 1675, we think, called the Warrant design for St Paul's and its spire. So you can see on the sort of top right, that's the Warrant design, and on the left, that's what William Morgan drew, and then the bottom right is what it actually looks like. So this is a London that is partly imagined and doesn't actually exist when Morgan was doing his map. And there are a lot of, for example, livery company halls depicted on William Morgan's map. Some of those were finished after the Great Fire, others were not finished. So there's a bit of speculation going on there. I'll come back to that one in a sec. But just to think about the size of the maps. So this is, I came across this when I was visiting Chawton House a few years ago, in fact, and I was amazed to see it, because this is one of the first time I've actually seen a multi-sheet map like this pasted up onto a folding screen like this, and it just shows you how big they were. And somebody at some point, probably the 19th, maybe the 18th century, has taken John Roke's map and joined it up, pasted it rather like we did digitally, but actually pasted the sheets onto a folding screen. And it just shows you how large these things actually are, and why you need to have thousands and thousands of points to connect up when you're doing the georeferencing. But I'll go back now to the previous slide, which I skipped over. This is just an example of what you can sometimes find on maps. I mean, I found this fascinating and very interesting and provocative in some ways, because I mean, this is Hallward's map on the left and Greenwood's map on the right, both again very huge maps of London. And on the right, you can see the Tower of London and the various buildings inside the tower. But on the left, you can see there's nothing inside it apart from an inscription which says, "The internal parts not distinguished being refused permission to take the survey." So clearly Hallward tried to get in to the Tower of London to do his surveying, but was told, no, sorry, maybe national security, something like that, who knows, but he was refused access. So it does make you think about what people were allowed and not allowed to see and to survey when these maps were made. So what happens when you digitize maps and georeference them is you don't just create digital images. What you can also do is to extract information from the maps. So what we did with all of our maps was to do a really detailed extraction of information about places, about streets, about boundaries and all kinds of things. So this is an initial sort of schematic extraction of data, which becomes more refined when you play around with it, showing the area around Merchant Taylor's Hall in the City of London, right in the middle, with Draper's Hall, Draper's Gardens, and all exchange around there. And this creates sort of another digital layer of information which you can sort of plant on top of this map, or indeed other maps if you want, and analyze the space and all sorts of things. So we essentially squeeze the juice out of every map by digitizing not just the image but also information contained. And also, when you do that, you can create a sort of concordance of information between maps of different eras. So you can find out how the street patterns changed over time. And I can show you an example of that now. So on this slide, what we've done is to extract all of the streets from 1682 from William Morgan's map. And then on top of that, in blue, you've got the streets as they were in 1746. So what happens between the late 17th and the mid 18th century is that London doesn't just get bigger, it also gets denser. So this is the eastern fringe of the city. So all of the blue lines that you can see are infilling the brown lines of the 17th century. So there's a lot you can sort of tell from this kind of analysis of the space of the streets. And again, all of this information was extracted from William Morgan's map and from John Roke's map. Now, our sort of early experimental project was called Locating London's Past, and miraculously, it's still alive on a server hosted by the University of Sheffield. It's still going. And what we did was to play around with using historic maps, in this case, Roke's map, to link it to data. And one of the big data sets we used was the Old Bailey feedings online, which many of you will be familiar with. And we tried to work out how you could geocode all the data and interrogate it and do fancy things with data sets and different types of crime and all sorts of things. And it was both an exercise in actually the georeferencing itself, which was important as a proof of concept for Layers of London, but also how you link data to it. And I'll show you an example of what you can do is to look at pickpocketing offences and where they were distributed, at least as far as the trials were concerned in the places mentioned. So unsurprisingly, a lot of pickpocketing took place in main shopping streets. In the middle of the screen, you've got St Paul's there, and then Cheapside along there, Cornhill, and so on. So a lot of pickpocketing in those main central shopping streets. And you can do loads of other things as well, but if you have time, please do take a look. Now, this brings you on to modern map making, and what the first two examples from the Historic Towns Trust, where the cartographer Giles Dark has been working on maps of London. And these maps are fantastic because they're combining historical and archaeological evidence from the past that historians have accumulated with modern cartography. So these maps are sort of drawn on top of an Ordnance Survey framework, but showing the streets, the places, the churches, the livery company halls, and so on as they were in particular periods. So we now have two of these maps, and they're both on Layers of London. We were a very nice partnership between the HTT and Layers of London meant that Giles sent us the digital files. They were very easy to georeference because they were made on top of Ordnance Survey frameworks, and we've put them on Layers of London to explore. So this is the map of medieval London, and then we have one of Tudor London as well. So you can see how London is accumulating, different kinds of institutions, the livery company halls in particular, being developed over that period. And then as part of that partnership, Giles very kindly did a webinar for us. We have lots of webinars on we have a YouTube channel, and one of Giles's webinars is on there. So you can look at how he created the London maps. If you have a moment, do go and look at that YouTube channel and listen to Giles talking about how he made the London map. So I want to sort of pause and give a bit of an example of what you can do with these sort of layers of maps. And this is a quote from John Stow's Survey of London. You know, John Stow, the great antiquarian, the first historian of London in many ways. And he's talking here about a street called Hog Lane, which he describes where it is, north towards St Mary's Spital, but outside Bishopsgate. But I think the very evocative description where he talks about it having on both sides fair hedgerows of elm trees as bridges and easy stiles to pass over into the pleasant fields where citizens use to walk, shoot, and otherwise to recreate and refresh their dulled spirits, something we all need sometimes. And a very evocative pastoral, nostalgic scene. And John Stow was very nostalgic, but this is typical of his nostalgia. And so that's a very rural sort of depiction of London. And if we use layers of London, we can see, and I've sort of very crudely highlighted in blue where Hog Lane was. And on the left, you have the Tudor London map showing Hog Lane stretching sort of northwest. And on the right-hand side, the earliest sort of woodcut map, the Argus map of London, again with some cows and sheep and people scattered around so this is definitely a pastoral countryside scene in both cases. But if we use layers of London's way of adding map layers to your view, you can see this is Faithorne and Newcourt map. It's a pre-Great Fire map, sort of 1640s, done in a sort of bird's eye view. So that's why it looks a bit odd, because it's been warped a bit to fit on a modern framework. But it shows some of the development that's taken place along that street in the late 16th, early 17th centuries. Houses, some gardens being laid out along that street as well. If we carry on through time, this is now Morgan's map in 1682, and it's not called Hog Lane anymore. It's called Petticoat Lane, much more familiar to many of us. And of course, it's now part of quite a dense urban conurbation, now an urban area outside the city walls. You can see the black line to the bottom left of the blue line is the city boundary, city wall of London. And in fact, Petticoat Lane, Hog Lane was actually on the boundary of the City of London's jurisdiction. So you can see, again, change over time from the 16th century right through until the end of the 17th century here. And on Layers of London, we have a few records associated with Petticoat Lane about the market, of course. And by the late 19th century, Petticoat Lane's the name's changed again. It's now Middlesex Street, but Petticoat Lane survives in terms of the market, as we all know. So that's a sort of journey through one particular street, showing how it changed, how the urban environment changed, again, using maps as layers to show that change. So I want to talk about a particular sort of sub-project now, and again, it shows how we've worked with some of our heritage partners, which have had amazing collections of maps, other kinds of sources that we've wanted to digitize and put on Layers of London in different ways. And some of these have involved volunteers who've been cataloguing and doing various other things, and a way of allowing our partners to disseminate some of their collections, which are not always very easy to get out to the public. And I think there's an important moment when we started where a number of libraries were starting to think about their dissemination strategy in a more sort of serious way in terms of free access in particular. So they're quite happy to give us some really substantial collections. And the one I want to show you is the on the right hand side is the RAF aerial photographic collection from the late 1940s, where Historic England gave us 24,000 of these photographs of London taken from the air by planes at the end of the just after the end of the war. Extraordinary level of detail. And what we did was to work with hundreds of volunteers who geo-referenced every single photograph for us using a special tool we developed. And the outcome of that was effectively a single image from the air of London. And you can see all the individual images sort of tiled together here on the screen. There are one or two little gaps here and there, but mostly it's pretty complete. And that's down to volunteers. We did, the project team didn't do this. We got volunteers to do it. Some of them were very competitive and did lots and lots of georeferencing for us, which is great. But we ended up with this very this wonderful sort of mosaic of aerial photographs. And this is an example of the quality of the photographs. This shows the British Museum in the centre of the image, and Senate House, and my office building a bit further to the northwest of that, and Russell Square. So really exceptional quality. And also you can start to see some bomb damage. Just sort of, if you move right from the British Museum, you can see some empty blocks, damaged blocks. And then you can see that more effectively on this aerial photograph of St Paul's Cathedral and the bomb damage around St Paul's, which is quite serious, as you can see, and famously so in that famous image of St Paul's with the smoke around it. And then what we can do on Layers of London is to compare this image, the aerial image, with the bomb damage map which London Metropolitan Archives hold, and the dark purple colours reflect the very serious damage to the area immediately around St Paul's. So again, you can use the overlays to sort of peel back and look at that kind of phenomenon. And a second project I wanted to mention more briefly perhaps is a partnership with LSE Library, where they of course hold the wonderful Charles Booth poverty maps and all the notebooks and so on that Booth and his fellows created. And what we did was, as well as having the actual map on the website, which is wonderful enough in itself, we again developed a special digital tool, and we got volunteers to trace around each of these individual coloured blocks, because what we wanted to do was to separate out the layers. So you could choose a layer, and I'll show you the next slide. You can choose layers reflecting the lowest class, the vicious, the semi-criminal, or you can choose the comfortable and the poor, or you can choose a combination of all of those, and really look at a particular, how these are distributed across London. So these become layers, more layers of London effectively, by again really extracting all the information possible from Booth's map. And again, this was done by volunteers in a crowdsourcing project. And then I mentioned earlier some of the data sets we have. I won't spend much time on these. London's listed buildings. Again, we acquired this data set, and I've just highlighted the Cabman's Shelter, which is again just outside my office in Bloomsbury. Does a very good bacon sandwich and cup of coffee. But loads and loads of other listed buildings across the city. And then a data set actually compiled by one of my former PhD students on furniture makers in London, again divided into different periods, but showing where furniture makers, both humble and elite furniture makers, lived in the city. And then another example of a partnership was with, and I think about 15 to 20 borough archives worked with us, and we sort of challenged the borough archives, so to speak, to identify some of their most interesting and potentially useful maps in their collections. And most of these have never been sort of seen publicly, certainly not digitized before. And we had a small budget we had to use, and we digitized those maps and again put them on our website. So I think, yeah, around 10 to 15, maybe more, boroughs contributed to this project. So that's really what I wanted to say about the maps at this point. Happy to talk later in questions about maps as well. But I wanted to sort of move on to contributing, and how do you contribute to this project? Well, we have a number of ways you can do that. The sort of the core thing you can do is to create a record about a building, a place, a person, whatever you like. And then records can be gathered together in collections, and then collections can be, combined into projects. So you can have multiple collections within a project and so on. And you can also include trails within projects too. And there's a sort of step-by-step process you go through to create a record. And on the right hand side, that's just the sort of the tiles at the top where you identify the location, you give it a title, you add images and videos if you want to, you give it a date, then you decide if you want to add it to any projects, then you can add links. And then an important feature, which I'll look at in a moment, is that you can categorize your record. In fact, it's compulsory to categorize your record. That's so other people can find it more easily. And then finally, and this is quite important, we want you to attribute your information. Where did you get it from, basically? And we don't demand sort of academic style referencing, but we do want to know where you got your stuff from, because it's helpful for other people. And generally it's good practice for you to do that. And at any point you can save your records as a draft and come back to them later on. And this is why we want to add categories. So on the left, you can choose a number of categories that we sort of came up with to attach to your record or collection. Religion and worship, places of worship, fraternities, whatever. And then on the right-hand side, if you want to search layers of London, you can choose some of these categories and then run a search just on the category, or you can narrow by date range, or you can add a search term and sort of combine different ways of finding information. Or further down, you can select a London borough if that's what you want to do as well. So that's why categorizing is so important, as well as being able to search by free text. And there is also a Layers of London guide. Just playing the video here so you can see it. There's a tutorial which was compiled by HUMAP, which is a helpful way of telling people how to add records in particular. So I won't play that any more of that, but there are, I think, 4 video tutorials now that you can use to learn how to do different kinds of things on Layers of London, including searching for things. And we also have a PDF user guide that you can download on the front page of the website too. So I want to say, yeah, and finally, I should just mention our walking tours, which are relatively new. This one was compiled by a colleague of mine, in fact, Sarah Pennell, who's at Greenwich University for her students, looking at walking tours in St James and Mayfair, particularly the 17th, 18th century. And this is a relatively new feature that we've got on the website now. So do please have a look at that. And then thinking about some of the other partnerships we've entered into, mentioning one, it's almost at random in a sense, that this is Bexley Archives, where we actually worked with an intern who did some amazing work in working with this collection of planning applications from Bexley Archives, and they're actually, I mean, they're wonderful drawings, in fact, of houses of the period from the very late 19th century, but mostly sort of 1920s, 1930s. And then it's a huge array of buildings of different kinds of shops, of houses, all sorts of things. But what I particularly liked in this one is that on the top, sort of on the left-hand pane at the top, you've got a shed for experimental purposes. The purpose was not quite clear to anybody what that was for, but it's intriguing nonetheless to see that in a planning application. I suspicious potentially. But Lacey Bonar, who is the intern, did a great job of cataloguing and writing up these individual records. And a really key partnership for us was with London Metropolitan Archives for all sorts of reasons, but particularly because of the access to the London County Council archive of photographs, and we divided their photographs into a number of collections. This one is on housing London. And it's a remarkable collection because, on the left-hand side, it shows the sort of the end of the slums, if you like, in London, and then the building of some estates like the Dickens estate on the site of Oliver Twist Court. That's a really evocative photograph taken in the 1920s, and then other sort of high-rise estates built in the late 60s too. A partnership with the Conway Library, more images. They chose around couple of 115 photographs of hugely varied sites in London, from the Becontree Estate through to Crystal Palace and Battersea Town Hall, all kinds of things. And again, there was a really good project where volunteers went to great lengths to find out about these buildings and write up very, very detailed records for us. And another partnership with the National Trust, this one looking at a subject that you wouldn't necessarily think of when you think of the National Trust, which is to do with corner shop stories in London. And it's a story of, in many cases, of migration to the city, which is a big theme in Layers of London, really. Many of our records, many of our collections are to do with migrant communities of different kinds. And this is, again, contributing to the National Trust strategies to reach new audiences. Think about different kinds of heritage assets. The corner shop as a heritage asset. It's a very important and interesting idea. And then, thinking more broadly about working with community partners. I mean, some of the work is actually potentially actually quite controversial in some ways. And working with the Museum of the Home brings you into contact with debates about statues, and in this case, Geoffrey's statue, and so on. And it's a way of thinking about what does heritage mean in different contexts to different kinds of communities, and allowing local communities to sort of share their thoughts on heritage is actually quite important. And also contributing to debates about placemaking, as it's called, in different parts of London. This way of connecting the past, present, and thinking about the future of particular communities. But then going on to sort of some of the collections created by not by our institutional partners, but by the public. Our largest single collection of that kind is actually on London pubs, a collection of 1,263 pubs. As we know, pubs are heritage assets that are disappearing all the time. Many are closing every single week in London. And this is the person who organised this felt very strongly that he and the volunteers in the project wanted to do that sort of preservation work digitally, to record as much information as possible about pubs in different places right across the city. And I just sort of zoomed in here on pubs sort of along some part of the docks area, so particularly along the waterfront. There, the Captain Kidd pub is the one I chose at the bottom. And then, using the search facility, you can uncover a lot of sort of cross-cutting themes. So I searched here for suffrage campaigns and gender equality here, and a huge range of records from different collections. The one I've sort of showing you here is about Edith Garrod, the famous suffragette and jiu-jitsu specialist who trained suffragettes to resist the police and fight back in many cases. And was depicted by Helena Bonham Carter in the film Suffragette a few years ago, for example. So again, to really interesting stories of individuals in London, but associated with some of these huge themes for London's history. Again, another small example of someone who's mapped sort of prominent Scotsmen, Scottish people in London, but particularly looking at the sort of the Mayfair area south of Oxford Street, just so both a geographical focus in terms of the map, but also in terms of the community itself. And this is an example of someone who's interested in Gothic architecture, different kinds. Really interesting collection, very well put together. But again, scattered right across the city. Some interesting examples from Pancras to Strawberry Hill House and the Royal Courts of Justice, and so on. And then I think this is almost the last one to show you. This is someone who's really interested in Robert Adam and the many craftsmen who worked on buildings associated with Adam in London. Many of those craftsmen were, again, migrant craftsmen of different kinds. And you can see some examples here of some of the individuals. David Adamson, who's a house painter, Pietro Maria Borghese, and then a record about the Adam office itself in Albemarle Street. And then one of our actually, it was quite an early partnership in many ways, was with the Pope's Grotto Preservation Trust. And this is before they themselves got Heritage Lottery funding, and I think we had, I think we had something to do with the fact they got it, because we worked so closely together in an early stage, because they were interested in restoring Alexander Pope's grotto at his property, but also in thinking about other sites associated with Pope right across London. And I mean, on the right, you can see these sites pinned against a lesser known map in our collection, which is John Roke's other map of 1746, which is London 10 miles round, which is a really wonderful map going, as I said, right, much further out than many of our maps do. And this is a way of just showing the Pope collection on that. And then if you zoom right in, this is sort of detail you can get. On the left is the record about the grotto itself, compiled by the trust, and on the right is the zoomed in image of the gardens in the building at the time in Twickenham. So that's really what I wanted to say. I was sort of tour through Layers of London, what it does, what it's for in particular. I think is important, and it's just a closing slide. I think it's really important to credit all the people who've been involved with these projects. There are many more, all our volunteers who worked on the georeferencing, as well as all the thousands of people who contributed records to the project. So I will leave it there. I'm happy to answer questions or make any comments that people would like me to. So thank you very much.
And thank you so much for that, Matthew. I must say, from a personal point of view, it was really interesting to look at some of those, because although you said that it was pure fluke, I grew up in the London Borough of Bexley. I am joining the Midlands now, so that's my local archive, so I'll definitely check that out. And I was taught by Sarah Pennell. So again, lots of connections that I wasn't expecting this evening, and I'm sure many people have found the same. Before we start looking at the questions that have been coming in throughout this presentation, Caroline, did you have any thoughts or questions for Matthew, first of all?
Well, I have lots of questions, but I think actually I'm going to, my questions correspond in some ways with some of the questions that have been asked.
Okay,
somebody asked, and it's Michael, I think it was, who said, how do we start? How do you start to help or add or to map? I think that's perhaps almost, you assume that, Matthew, because you do it all the time.
Yeah, well, first of all, you need to create an account on Layers of London. That's very easy to do, just username and password. And then on the screen I showed you right at the start, which I can sort of go back to if you like, there's a button at the top called Contribute, and you just click that button and it takes you into Contribute menu, which I showed you earlier. I didn't want to do a sort of live demonstration, because if you do that, it's bound to go wrong. So I thought I'd just show you screenshots is always the best way, I think. But please do experiment. There is a contribute button, which is what you need to do, but you need to have an account first.
Definitely, and I'm sure that there's quite a few elements to do with that, the more technical questions that some people may have on those tutorial videos, I imagine, Matthew, as well, that are on YouTube. Fantastic. And as we can see in the comments of the chat, everyone's saying that it's an amazing project and well done, very interesting, and lots of things there. I'm just going to go to the chat first. I appreciate that there was some Q&A questions first, but the chat moves a little bit quicker. Neil has asked, what safeguards do you have in place so that you do not lose your data, in this project as software formats become obsolete?
Well, yes, that's absolutely right. And in fact, is one of the reasons why we migrated to HuMap, because we were very conscious that after our funding ended, first of all, you promised the lottery that you're going to keep your project going for 5 years somehow, and you have a bit of funding to do that, but not a lot, in fact. And you have the worry at all times that your code's going to go out of date, that some of the free sort of software we're using is going to change, all sorts of things. So that's one of the reasons why we sort of went in with HuMap, who we'd worked with before, was because they take care of all that. So they will upgrade the software. They will make sure we have the right open source tools attached to the website, all of that sort of thing that they do now. So I think in a sort of imperfect world, in a way where you can't, don't have unlimited funding to keep yourself going, somebody has to host it, someone has to take care of the maintenance of the project. This for us was the best solution. think. Some projects keep going because they manage to get grant after grant after grant, and they have to do many more different things to justify getting those grants. I think we got to the point where we thought, well, we have something where we're quite happy with. There are things we still want to do with Layers of London. I think there's augmented reality, that kind of thing would be a really interesting direction to go to do a sort of street view of London in different periods would be fantastic and amazing. That really would involve another big chunk of money. But for what we're doing, having digitized maps, georeferenced maps, and crowdsourced content, we felt this is the right moment to sort of go in with a partner who could sort of shelter us and bring us in line with other projects that were part of the partnership.
Definitely. And then on some more technical questions, Simon's got a few in there.
Right.
He was straight off the bat, so that was really impressive, Simon, that you found the Q&A section right away. He asked, firstly, are all maps copyrighted, or is there a date from which you can use them from? And secondly, is there a digital map making program available, or is it best to use something like Inkscape?
Well, I don't know Inkscape very well. I think, well, I mean, on the first question about copyright, I mean, maps, it depends on the map, I guess, because the Ordnance Survey, for example, closely guards its copyright in its maps and releases them in different ways through the National Library for Scotland and other websites. In other cases, you have very old maps where there are only a few copies surviving, like William Morgan's map, that are held by repositories like the British Library, for example. And increasingly, and this has actually happened over the past 5 or 6 years, libraries like the British Library are much happier about giving away, making available freely their digitized maps, so anybody can use them, usually on for a non-commercial purpose. So we use a Creative Commons license for all of our content on Layers of London, but it's a non-commercial use, as long as you meant to attribute the content to the original creator. So we're very keen on sharing content, and we make sure that everybody who adds something to our website, whether it's a record or whether it's a map, is made available through a Creative Commons license on that sort of basis. So we're very happy to share stuff. We have to make sure we work with partners who are prepared to share their stuff with us on that basis too. But that's become much easier in the last few years.
There's one, Megan, there's a question here, isn't there, from, I think it's Sharon asked this question. How do you ensure that the information is correct?
Yes.
That's a great question, and it's one we struggled with and discussed vigorously earlier in the project, even before we put the grant application. How on earth do we do this? And we decided in the end that we couldn't. That it's simply impossible to act as a kind of Wikipedia. We don't have thousands of dedicated users who will constantly monitor records and correct them in the same way that Wikipedia does. So what we rely on is a sort of response mode approach, where you can feed back on records. If you think that something's in the wrong place, you can report it. We're trying to work on that functionality a bit better, so it's not just seen as reporting somebody, it's actually just making a suggestion in a more positive sort of way. But that's really how we work, that we can't check everything. So there is a sort of buyer beware sort of caveat that we need to use with all of this. But in a way, that's part of, that's also why we want people to provide citations and where did you get your stuff from, because it means somebody can go and check. And that's part of historical inquiry in a way. So we're not as worried about it as we were before we started the project, I think.
If Matthew, if somebody finds a mistake and wants to correct something, they can report it. There is a
Yep.
And then who corrects it?
Well, what we can do is to pass it on to the original creator.
Uh-huh.
And they can do it, or sometimes we have been known to go in and edit it ourselves, though we don't want to do that as a sort of routine, because the records are, we feel that the individuals who created them have a sort of a bit of an ownership over it, so we don't want to be the sort of the police officer coming in and sort of editing everything. But we have been known, if there's a really clear case where something's just in the wrong place, obviously in the wrong place, and it's just an accident, we'll go through and move the pin to the right place, for example.
Cool. And on the flip side, can you favourite certain overlays? Sharon also asked that you used a lot of save searching and that sort of thing.
Yeah, you'll be able to save, and this is more, again, this is part of being part of the HUMAP family, is that they are adding more functionality. So yes, you will be able to like things and do all the sort of the stuff you can do on sort of Facebook and Twitter. And we don't want too much of that necessarily. But I think so. We're just sort of playing it by ear and saying, well, when is the right moment to introduce some of these things? Because sometimes things just go out of fashion in other social media, for example, so it might not last very long. But I think, when you get enough users and when you get enough content, then sometimes having a sort of favorite system can work. I mean, we do know we have very detailed stats on our most used collections and so on, so we're able to sort of see what people are using, which is quite interesting.
What are your most used?
I need to check what it is today. For some reason, St Pancras Station was very high up our records. There's also a record about
Sorry, Matthew, what do people learn about? I mean, they know where St Pancras Station is.
Well, this is a record about St Pancras, about the architecture.
Right.
So, about
but
the
why
whole
does
building.
that have to be on Layers of London? Sorry.
Because somebody's added it as a record.
I see. Yeah. Okay. But it's not mapping particularly.
Yeah. Well, we can find out which are the most popular maps and which are the most popular records. So there are particular maps which are very popular. The Ordnance Survey maps are really popular, of course, because people can sort of relate quite closely to those in terms of their own lives in many cases, or the lives of their parents and grandparents. So OS maps are very, very popular.
Oh, wow. And in terms of just some additional sources that people were obviously very interested in, both Simon and Leslie have mentioned, of course, that there might be potential German Air Force photographs. I take it that they potentially might cover London and it would have to be uploaded via someone who was interested in that topic.
Yes, well, we're always interested in hearing about other maps that we don't have. And actually, that's a really nice example of, yes, there were maps created by German government before the Second World War and during, showing sort of areas where they might want to attack or even use as after a successful invasion and so on. So if somebody has access to those, we'd be very pleased to have them. I mean, they're relatively straightforward to georeference. We have a GIS consultant who can do that. So yeah, we're always really happy to hear about new maps that we don't have.
Wonderful. And Peter's also asked whether oral history records have contributed to the project at all.
Yes. Again, one of the things you can do is you can add video, you can add audio clips, any kind of media to your record. So yes, we do have a number of collections, not as many as we'd like. We'd like to have more, but we'd like to have more interviews and so on. There's a great collection of where we worked with, I can't remember the name of the school now, but it's a school where there are a lot of children of Afghan refugees, migrants to London. And as part of the project, the children interviewed their grandparents about coming to London. It's just a really actually quite a moving set of interviews with their grandparents. These little kids of about 5 or 6 interviewing their grandparents about how they came to be in London. What were things like in Afghanistan and so on. So we have some collections like that, but we'd like to have more oral history, certainly.
Definitely. And then Deborah's also mentioned again another website that you might be aware of, London Remembers, as they include mapping and documenting of statues, plaques and other memorials. I'm sure you've already heard of these before if you've not already worked with them.
Yes, well, there are a number of other sort of similar kinds of projects, or rather projects that have sort of overlaps with us in very interesting ways. There's a great project in Hackney called Footways, which was launched recently. They launched a map of footways, walking trails around Hackney, and we've worked quite closely with them, and they've got a collection on our website. So we're not precious at all about it. I mean, we love working with different projects because they often have particular specialist interests which complement ours. We want to be very, very broad and capacious and have anything. We won't turn anyone away, as it were. And then there are projects that want to focus on particular kinds of history, or like statues, or they want to focus on particular kinds of people, or just on a particular area. So yeah, we want to work with all of them, really.
Definitely, and that probably links to Hayden's question about Cumbria having their collection of poor surveys and how they could be connected to migration histories. So I think those could certainly be added by the sounds of things.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
and
I think.
yes.
Sorry, any information that anybody has that's linked to a place in London, then you can add it. Yeah.
And Michael asks the range for layers of London. So 10 miles was something that you mentioned. And he asks because he covers a museum at Croydon and Carshalton. Apologies if I've mispronounced that second word. Is that too far out from the Layers of London project?
Well, I mean, we've always been, what is London? I think we've taken one definition as the boroughs, the London boroughs. So that's a sort of, you know, when we thought about how we'd explain London to the Heritage Lottery Fund and others, they said, well, it's the boroughs. But you know, we do have records and collections that go further, a little bit further, the M25 a bit further than that sometimes. So we're not too precious about it. London means different things to different people. And of course, you know, when we're going back to the 17th century and 16th century, London was a very small place geographically speaking, and as we saw, you know, it becomes urbanized over the coming centuries. So urban London isn't the same thing in the 16th as it is today. So I think, yeah, we're reasonably sort of flexible at the edges about what London means.
That's good then. And Sharon has just clarified that she meant favoriting rather than saving, but I imagine that's the same functionality in the future. And then my apologies, the chat has moved slightly up. Sorry, hello David. David has asked, how did the map makers obtain their coordinates? So going back to history there a little bit.
Okay, well that's really interesting, because there were surveyed maps. So William Morgan's was a surveyed map and John Roke was a surveyor. And the way that they would do it was to try and take measurements from particular points, and they would often use church towers as a way to use their kit to, you know, to take readings across to different places. And there's even, I didn't show, but there's a slide from the Roke map showing John Roke using his equipment on top of a church tower. And one of the things we discovered when we were georeferencing the maps is that the fit onto the modern map is much better in the City of London because there are lots of church towers. The fit gets worse the further out you go because the church towers are further apart. So you can really see this in certain parts of London, that the surveying becomes more trickier because you're having to, your points of reference are further apart. So that was how it was done. But actually, I mean, I think what we found, I mean, the image I showed of Morgan's map right near the start, there's relatively little warping. It's not that, you know, for a map as old as that, the surveying was pretty good. So we can't really complain about it.
And Sharon's put in the chat as well, that's absolutely fascinating and I couldn't agree more. And then just a couple of questions about specific maps. Firstly, Simon asked the best maps to use to find out borough boundaries in London pre-1965. Is there a one that you'd recommend?
That's a good question. I might need to come back on that. I mean, we do have, for every borough in London, we do have sort of a borough outline, but that's a modern borough outline. I mean, most of the boroughs have the boundaries have been fairly consistent for quite a long time. So you can use our tool for each of the boroughs where we have maps. We've also got an outline map or just an outline layer, so you can sort of plonk that on top of your map.
Oh, definitely. And then Sharon has asked, with the pubs slide that you looked at, is that an overlay?
Well, yes. I mean, technically, it's a collection because it's of individual records. I mean, the difference between a collection and overlay is a sort of, you know, partly a technical one, really, rather than anything else. An overlay is really a collection of points with data attached, whereas the pubs collection has been assembled through individual records that have been put into a collection, so to speak, rather than being from a data set. So it's a bit of a it's not a very clear distinction in some ways. It's partly about how it's been loaded into the site in a way.
Okay, that's really interesting. I can't see any more open questions, so I'll just give I'll just Phil, just in case someone's got a last minute question to come through. But just to say thank you again, that was absolutely fascinating, and not just because I'm a sort of Londoner. I don't want to upset some people this evening who don't think that that is London, but anyway. And I think that it was a really interesting project, like so many people were putting in the chat. And to quote, let me find it. Jay Wisdom has put, "Thank you, interesting but oh so daunting." And I think that it's an absolutely fascinating project that will influence so many different local histories. But I can't see any more questions coming through. Caroline, did you have any final thoughts?
I have questions, of course, that relate
Always
of their various kinds. But Matthew, I thought that was really interesting because it shows you, I suppose we're brought up as thinking that maps are about buildings and streets. And actually, a map is a verb to use to describe people, where people are and where things happen and where incidents take place. It's not just about buildings and streets.
Yeah.
You know, and I thought that your description of Hog Lane and the way it changed, and in a sense, it's about that it ends up being a market, as it were, a petticoat market, but it's not just a street. It's about the people who live there and what goes on there. And you're sort of peopling the maps in many ways.
Yes, exactly. It's about it's the interaction of people and the environment, essentially.
Yeah, I'm just trying, because I'm a medievalist, and you're a medievalist too. You mustn't forget that, Matthew. That what we could do, you know, to do similar kinds of projects. We have tended to focus in medieval studies more just be so pleased to have a map. We haven't thought what we might do with it in terms of mappings and documents. And there is, just to tell you, and I'm sure you know this, a man at Cambridge called Manuel Eisner, who is mapping the coroner's record. So where did crimes that were murders, as it were, take place?
Yes.
Is there a particular area of London particularly prone, like your pickpockets later on?
Exactly.
And there are other things that we need to think imaginatively about the records in the way that perhaps modern historians have already done, to think about how we can actually people medieval London. You know, where did people, we have looked a bit about where did people in particular crafts live, and have tried to do that, and the changes brought about by the Black Death. So it's really fascinating, Matthew, and it's helpful to have it explained and to think how we can actually use it. So it's been a great evening.
Definitely. And Peter said, obviously, this should happen for all towns, and I couldn't agree more thinking about that. Just a quick one that's coming from Michael. Is there help available to support museums and things like that if they're stuck when putting in the information?
Yes, I mean, I think there's an email address you can contact us if you need help. I mean, we're a very small team now, so don't worry if you don't hear straight away, but we will try and get back to you.
Fantastic. And I think that brings us to the end. And just to repeat that again from Peter, of this should happen for all towns. And I think that many of us may have been inspired to either support the project in some way, or think of collaborations there, or perhaps attempt to replicate it in towns of interest to them, or villages and that sort of thing, or connect migration histories, like Hayden said, up in Cumbria. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to draw the webinar to a close now. Thank you again, Matthew, for your time this evening. Everyone's come away, I think, knowing so much more. And we've got little claps, virtual claps.
They're floating up here.
Yes, that's great.
Yes, you'll need to map those, Matthew. Yes,
exactly. And so just quickly before we head off, thank you so much for joining us, to our audience this evening. Our next webinar in the series is on Thursday, the 6th of April at 7 p.m, where we will be joined by John Moore, who will be talking about mapping urban Britain using a Scottish perspective. So we're going to be connecting what Matthew talked about, where mapping Scotsman in London, to actually being in Scotland next week, or 2 weeks' time rather. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope you have a lovely evening. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Thank you.